A Texas lawmaker wants to require private institutions accepting school vouchers to have the same state reporting requirements as public schools. KLTV7's Michael Richardson explains.
Our private schools are not held to those accountability standards. And the reason why public schools are held to those standards is because they receive public funds.
Democratic State Representative Michaela Plisa has called school vouchers a scam. A bill she filed would require that private schools abide by the same reporting requirements as public schools if they accept taxpayer funds. Academic performance is included in those mandates.
Private schools right now, they're allowed to conduct their own testing rather than using the STAR test or state standardized testing, and they don't have to publish those results. So my bill, that would be one of their requirements.
The bill comes as some Texans have expressed concern that the current school voucher legislation would not be accountable to taxpayers.
The private school may not want to participate in the program. That's also an option.
Smith County GOP Chair David Stein says there is a chance that private schools choose not to accept school vouchers.
When you're dealing with similar type of reporting, you also could have similar requirements in relation to curriculum. So if you want reports turned in a certain way with certain information, it could steer the curriculum. That's one of the disadvantages of any system, is that in a private school, that school has the right to accept or not accept that particular student.
Representative Plisa's proposed law has not received a committee assignment. Michael Richardson, KLTV7 News.
Governor Greg Abbott expects school vouchers to pass in the State House in early April. New tonight, the city